I don't like to divide things up. I do realise, and I think where you're getting to there in your question is, and in your observation of what I've written, is that we do have what I call the parallel economies. There's lots of parallels. So we have a parallel of where we've got people who are planning holistically and who are farming in the best, who are practising agricultural methods which are as close to natural methods as they can. And then you have another side where you've got people who are at once trying to care for their land but are trying to reduce the variables. And they do that through the use of modern chemistry and quite novel chemistry, and also the use of organisms who've been genetically modified. So you've got that. Now, both of those groups have something in common, that they want the future to be better, and they want the future for their family to be better, and they're also trying to work within the economic conditions that are in front of them. And they are very individual, but they are also somewhat, the market conditions in the commodity stream is something that's out of everyone's control. But, yeah, so we look at it and go, okay, well, we have actually a lot more in common than we don't, and that's a big part of what's actually got to be brought to bear. And I think that
certainly
so much, and I appreciate being called a bridge here, because, I've been lucky that in the work that I've done, I've worked with both sides of that ledger, and I continue to work with conventional producers who still use chemistry, artificial chemistry, and I'm happy for that, because it informs me about what's going on there, but it also makes me realise, because in a lot of this sort of space, it's usually, you often get this divisive us and them sort of space. People like me might ordinarily be all organic and I can't tolerate anything else in the world, sort of absolutionist, and I just don't buy that.
Hi, this is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. On the phone from Victoria in Australia, I have Darren Dougherty of Regrarians.org. And Darren is a pathfinder and a pioneer in so many ways in how we work with the land, how we work with all the aspects of weather, of climate, of soil, of water, and how we bring community together, and also all the biota that live on that land. So, kia ora, thank you very much, Darren, for wanting to share with New Zealanders.
Well, good morning. Aotearoa is our second home. Our daughter has been in a relationship with a man from the North Island for 6 years, and we've spent a lot of time over there, so we're very, very happy to talk with you this morning.
Very good. Well, this is fantastic that you have this connection. I did an interview with Trish Allen last week, and when I mentioned your name, she lit up really, really brightly, because she's had you come to her land when she and Joe Palacia had Rainbow Valley Farm.
Yeah, that was back in the mid-noughties, and we first met Joe and Trish, I think, 2000 or 2001 in Tasmania, when they came visiting Bill Mollison, the late Bill Mollison, the co-founder of the permaculture movement, and they showed us what they were up to then, and we were very impressed, and we realised that we were kindred spirits and went on to be really famous friends. And it's interesting that Trish and my son-in-law, his mother and Trish are really firm friends. We also have family. My uncle lives in New Plymouth, and with his children who are grown up, and we're also very good friends with Greg Hart and Rachel down at Mangarara Station.
Yes.
And also Jodie Roebuck over at Taranaki. So and there's others who I'm probably neglecting to mention right now, but we've got a lot of friends in New Zealand, and we love getting over there. It's certainly a large part a green relief as much as anything from the rigours of your western neighbour.
Yes, I have lived in Australia for about 5 or 6 years in northern New South Wales and southern Queensland, so I do understand the challenges of having rainwater, and particularly the more into the hinterland you go, the drier it gets. Now, Darren, the whole blueprint that you're laying out across the landscape with Regrarian, you're doing regenerative agriculture, and this is just so fantastic. It's morphed out of permaculture, but you'll say that prior to this, a Mr. P.A. Yeoman. But I want you to be able to just explain to the New Zealand audience where you've come from, and then we can lead into what you're doing now.
Well, I've come from a farm outside of the central Victorian city of Bendigo, which is the third biggest city in the state of Victoria. It's an old gold mining town, but it's surrounded by quite good farming land. And so my Irish and Danish, German ancestors came here in the 1850s, 60s. I grew up on that farm. My father was killed in Vietnam when I was 3 months old in the Vietnam War. And so my grandparents they were quite young. My mother was young. They became my sort of de facto parents in a way, because my mother was so young. She was only 21. And my grandfather was born in 1915, so he was someone who had a whole lot of skills, rural skills, and so he always really imparted those on me. We had a very close relationship, as I did with my grandmother, who was, she might be well called a domestic goddess now. She was, as so many people of her generation before were, but particularly that generation, they were really good at home economics because they had some of the technology of food preservation in particular.
Yes.
And so she was, whereas her mother's generation didn't have that. So it was quite a ripe period, and I was influenced pretty heavily by that. And just the whole way the farm was laid out. My granddad had read about P.A. Yeoman's and had set up irrigation systems across the property, all flood irrigation with dams, which all collected water from catchment. And so from as young as I can remember, we did a lot of that work. We also had forests on the property, which is kind of unusual because Australians love to cut trees down and not replant them, unlike you Kiwis. And so I'm very interested in, suppose if you would ask me what are my greatest interests of all of the themes in this broad church of regenerative agriculture, it's probably water and forestry, and a lot of that's got to do with my youth and where I was raised. Since then, I became a chef, and I did itinerant waiting all around Australia after I left high school, and then got into hospitality, chefing, left that, got into the organic retailing. This is in my early 20s, and then started to find that I met a lot of the pioneers of the Australian organic movement, or organic farming movement, the epicentre of which is here in central Victoria, and they were a lot of our suppliers, so that sort of opened up the farming genie again. And a lot of them were asking me, what's so-and-so doing? So I found myself pretty well doing the role that I've continued to this day, and that's sharing the information of one producer with another producer. And that's pretty well what I do. I spend my day answering questions and saying, so-and-so over here has been doing this, that might help you. And that sort of approach is extended now to, I've got a client in Mexico whose climate is very similar to yours in Rockhampton in North Queensland.
Yes.
Here's what you might do. So, things haven't changed too much. It's just got a bit more broader and with a lot more people, I suppose, since my days at the counter of the local organic shop.
From what I can gather, you've got a huge amount of collections, and I've seen your itinerary since about 1993 of where you've been and all the different presentations you've been to and actually presented at as well. There's hundreds and hundreds, and this is, you must feel so well resourced when you go to all these different presentations, because you're meeting very, very focused people who see the seriousness of making sure they've got their own land. They want to make sure that that land is going to be treated appropriately in the most organic way you can, that you're going to have everything working in the regenerative sphere to give them a future and also their children a future.
Indeed. I think the biggest thing it's amazing. I didn't get out of Victoria until I was 18, and that was to go across the river. So, I was very poorly travelled as a child, but quite well read. reading has always been a big part of my life. But I think that the biggest thing that, we've done about 250 courses now or so around the world in about 50 or so countries, and working with so many people. Basically, I'm a bit of a sink, and I've been very fortunate to just glean the information off so many people and so many landscapes. And that's been done with a lot of intent too. I think I've got pretty good observational skills, which I think is a really important. Well, if you look at what a farmer is, and a successful farmer, they're many things. They're a good engineer, they're a really good observer, they're a pretty good, they're a very good critical thinker, and they're an integrationalist.
Yes.
And so they're skills that I was brought up to have and were spoken to me as being necessary. And so when I go out there in the world, I look at the world through that lens, and with that intent, of course. Intent's an amazing thing, I think. With that intent, you can then bring that to bear to help others, which is primarily what we do. And, we're really a network as much as anything else, and we really delight in getting to the point where we are now with the amazing internet technologies that we have, where we're getting to the point now where we're able to take on the role of a facilitator and connecting farmers with other farmers. And so, because some of the findings of reports more recently have been, as to the future of regenerative agriculture, have been that of all of the pathways that will work the most successfully, it'll be farmer-to-farmer extension. So that is where one farmer in one place is able to connect directly with another farmer in another place, and they pass on their knowledge directly, as opposed to it going through a consultant or government official or however else it has conventionally. So I'm very excited we've got to this point where we're able to facilitate those exchanges directly between producers.
You see, the holistic notion, you're pulling all the strands together, and it's a social thing as well as a natural thing, just based on all the biota that you're dealing with. And you're a walking encyclopedia, and you're bridging to all the different people now globally, which means that you can and we can really ramp up the transition from conventional farming into this new Regrarian, regenerative way of living on the land.
Yeah, well, let's see. The way you mentioned the word holistic, one of the methodologies that we've embraced and we've got really good relationships with is the holistic management movement. And I'd have to say that the biggest influences that we've had from a methodology perspective have been Keyline design the Keyline Plan by the late P.A. Yeomans,
yes,
and holistic management, which was developed initially by Alan Savory. There's sort of a whole lot of other movements outside of that, permaculture being one of them, developed by David and Bill here in Australia, and many, many others that have influenced. But it's really those two. And holistic management, just to get to your point on, I think one of the things that we really strongly emphasise is that it's important for people to self-determine. And that's what I really like about the holistic management process, is that the first thing that you do is you self-determine what you want out of your future. And you do so understanding where you're at and where your land is at. And I think that that's a really important first step, because if you wake up one morning and go, all right, I'm going to be an organic farmer, and you're thoroughly in debt and you've got, a really poor debt to equity ratio, you've got agronomists who are appointed to you by your bank and so on and so forth, and you want to become an organic farmer, good luck.
Yes.
With doing that, right? So, because you've got your debt, which is really appointing you to be a serf to your debtors. And so we think that therefore, say to a client like that, or to someone we're talking to like that, who's in that situation, well, all right, well, this is where you are right now. How about you self-determine what your future might look like? And you might have to suck it up for a few years, right? Because that's just the way it is.
The learning, yeah.
And Well, it's not just the learning, it's the fact that you've got to get out of your debt situation. You've got to restructure things. You've got to restructure your life. Because when you're in those sorts of situations, then you can't just... Well, it's very difficult for you to change the way you'll move because you just don't have access to the capital, which is, these are really practical matters that we see from time to time, and so they need to be talked about because, a lot of the people who have changed practice, well, the evidence is pretty clear. You've either got the people who were the early adopters anyway and who were in a position to become an early adopter, and that's about the 10% of farmers in this country who are doing more ecological agriculture. And then the rest of them, they would like, some of them, the first group would sort of like to change, but they're still waiting on the evidence, and they're still waiting on the market changes, and the other group may want to change, but find it difficult because of their debt to equity ratio and their inability to finance necessarily the transition. And that can be something, especially when you've got very dead soils, can be quite a challenge. Now, in the United States, the biggest movement in all of, if you like, it's been identified that there's 3 different strands, if you like, of regenerative agriculture. There's the kind of movement that Regrarians is involved with and the permaculture people are involved with, etc. Then there's the Savory Institute holistic management pathway, and then there's the cover cropping phenomena led by the likes of Gabe Brown and other farmers over there. And it's actually been the cover cropping people who have made the greatest leap in terms of acreage, particularly in terms of cropping area, not grazing area, but cropped areas. And that's largely because the technologies that they are familiar with are not having to be thrown away. So it's not as big a change for them. For a grazier, to change from conventional grazing, set stock grazing, over to holistically planned grazing is not a big change. It's basically, you just start fencing like a dairy farmer. You start doing electric fencing as opposed to hardwire fencing. So it's not a big change for someone like that. But for a cereal producer to go non-organic, to go from non-organic to organic, that's a huge change.
Yes.
So we need to understand all of these things when we're sort of broadly painting the picture. And I think that ultimately, as per my first statement, really comes back to using the tools of holistic management to understand where you're at and be really honest about that. And secondly, self-determine as much as you can and turn that on in you, because a lot of people are not doing that. They're not self-determining, and that's really sad, I think, for their lives, and it does disenable them from making the kind of decisions which will set them, their landscape and their families up for the next generations.
Thank you. Now, in one of your videos that I saw, well, I think it was the Regrarians platform and Rex, you mentioned, and I want to go over this because there will be, I trust, a lot of farmers who have not yet taken that leap. And in the introduction, you mentioned that there are 2 types of agriculture. There's the so-called conventional agriculture, which is applying either GE or GMOs and sprays and chemicals and pesticides. And then there's the other side, which is the organic and close to nature, working with nature because it's got us to here over the last so many thousands of years. Can you explain just a little bit, because I think how you expressed it was really, really clear to let people know that there is a way across this bridge, and I see you as a bridger on many levels, to let people realise that, one, there is a very viable way through and forward, and it's going to, I don't know, I'd say it's going to fulfil the soul of you and your family when you work the land naturally. Can you just explain that difference?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that I've not met a farmer yet or a grazier that I've met yet who doesn't have a care for their land, and doesn't have a care for their families, for that matter. We all start with that as a base, and I think that's I don't like to divide things up. I do realise, and I think where you're getting to there in your question is, and in your observation of what I've written, is that we do have what I call the parallel economies. There's lots of parallels. So we have a parallel of where we've got people who are planning holistically and who are farming in the best, who are practicing agricultural methods which are as close to natural methods as they can. And then you have another side where you've got people who are at once trying to care for their land but are trying to reduce the variables. And they do that through the use of modern chemistry and quite novel chemistry, and also the use of organisms who've been genetically modified. So you've got that. Now, both of those groups have something in common, that they want the future to be better, and they want the future for their family to be better, and they're also trying to work within the economic conditions that are in front of them. And they are very individual, but they are also somewhat, the market conditions in the commodity stream is something that's out of everyone's control. But, so we look at it and go, okay, well, we have actually a lot more in common than we don't, and that's a big part of what's actually got to be brought to bear. And I think that
certainly
so much, and I appreciate being called a bridge here, because I've been lucky that in the work that I've done, I've worked with both sides of that ledger, and I continue to work with conventional producers who still use chemistry, artificial chemistry, and I'm happy for that, because it informs me about what's going on there, but it also makes me realise, because in a lot of this sort of space, it's usually, you often get this divisive us and them sort of space. People
Yes.
like me might ordinarily be all organic and I can't tolerate anything else in the world, sort of absolutionist. And I just don't buy that, because, you have to, everyone wants more or less the same thing. My agenda, if I have any, is to help them realise that whatever ambition it is, the tools that they use, what I would like, my agenda, I do have an agenda with them, is to say, all right, well, let's really critically analyse the tools that you're using and how do they fit with what you really, really want. And when you actually get down to it, a lot of those tools, when you get down to what people really, really want, and when they understand some of this, they go, yeah, actually, I don't want to use some of those tools, but I will continue. Just like, I could, if I really nailed it now, I could say, well, gee, I really shouldn't be turning this light bulb on that's probably powered by coal-powered energy, or calling on this mobile phone right now. If I really look at my core ethics, it probably doesn't fit that well, but I still do it.
Yeah.
So it's really, that's the negotiation that the modern human has, in that we've got a world full of tools, and some of those tools are fit within what we really want for the future and don't provide for that. And then other ones I look at, just like this call here and this apparatus that we're using now, I can see that as being, if we use it judiciously and properly, then that can get us somewhere. Just like using glyphosate, which is a fairly topical chemical, that, I don't use glyphosate. I'll say, ask why you should use glyphosate and how does it fit against what you want for you and your family and your land's future. And then if you see that as being a step in the direction that you want to go, then by all means. So it's a very different approach as opposed to being absolutionist, which I've found to be quite, in some cases, quite degrading to landscapes when people don't have in front of them the full array of tools that are there.
Yes, very much so. Graham Sate, with his biological agriculture, he was very clear. He said, look, we just want to be able to, we don't want to go into all these don'ts and don't do this and don't do that.
Yeah.
We want to just work with what we can do now using just biological methods, and slowly they can bring everybody across. And so I definitely agree on it. Now, can I talk to you about the Regrarian platform and Rex? I found that wonderful how you expressed it. And are you able to give maybe 10 minutes or so on explaining what the REX is, please?
Well, the REX is a program that we've been developing for years. It came out of the Regrarians platform development. The Regrarians platform is based on, well, I wouldn't say it's based, it's an adaptation of P.A. Yeoman's Keyline scale of permanence, which he developed, well, he released in 1958. And we've used that for years as a framework for keyline design. But as Mr. Yeoman's identified himself, wasn't really holistic and it needed more work. And so we took it apart a bit and brought it back together and realised, all right, well, let's create a platform from this that is holistic. And so it includes extra layers, if you like. And so the Regrarians platform from number 1 to 8 is the same as the Keyline scale of permanence, although we've changed the emphasis. So it starts with, and it's a 10-layer platform. So it starts with climate, and that's about you, the climate between your ears. And climate's at the top of the table because it's the most difficult thing to change. And for depending on who you are and your psychological makeup, you may be someone who's quite able to change just because you were born an innovator. But then you might have been born really conservative too, and that's just the way you were born. And so of course, the climate that you have as a human is going to be perhaps as difficult to change as the climate of the biosphere, of the atmosphere. So climate is very much there. We also include in the climate layer the climate of regulations and the climate of international markets and all of those sorts of things. They're difficult to have an influence over, or they're very slow to move. Then we look at the geography, and geography is where we're looking at where we are and what our landscape looks like that we're functioning in. And so if we look at the relationship of what we call the climate, as we say, well, the climate is the rules of the game. Geography is the board game, because that's where you are, what you're working with, the proximity you have to others and to markets and all of the rest of it, and what your land shape is. And that's where we're looking at maps and all of that sort of stuff as well. And then we look at water. So water is what we call the first development layer. The first 2 layers we call are the constitutional layers or the foundational layers, because they are what they are, and they are what you, to an extent, create. Then we look at water and say, all right, well, what have you got in terms of water, in terms of quality and quantity right now, and what do you need to do what you need to do in life? So, and how will you get about that? So what are all the tools and techniques? Then the same for access, that's farm road and any other forms of access that we have. How are they going to fit in with the landscape that you've got and the enterprises that you're looking to run? Then we look at the forestry layer. And forestry for us, a lot of people will say, oh, forestry is all about the trees. Well, it's not, because an old saying, as you would know, you can't see the forest for the trees. And that's because forest and forest ecosystems are very broad and diverse in their type. And you might have 1 tree per hectare in some systems. And that's still a forest. A forest woodland, in fact, is what it's called. Open forest woodland. So there's a lot of different types of forest, but in the forest layer we look at how can we integrate woody plant systems, so plant systems, flora, fauna, in terms of all of the animal systems, both natural and domesticated, and also fungi. Fungi is a much overlooked kingdom of nature, and so we look at that in the forest, those 3 kingdoms of nature in the forestry layer, with the forest being the frame in which they all are in. Then we look at the buildings layer and, potentially how are we going to integrate buildings or retrofit them so that they're more energy efficient, and also look at what sort of built infrastructure as far as any sheds or any other animal enclosures that we might have, portable or otherwise, on-site processing infrastructure such as a lot of people are starting to do now on farm abattoirs and that sort of thing. And then we look at the fencing layer, number 7, which is where we're looking at, well, what kind of fencing systems will you have? We've developed a regime of what we call fencing styles, which is obviously a play on words, where we look at 5 fencing styles. We've got perimeter fencing, we've got yards and corrals, then we've got laneways, then we've got subdivision fencing, and then we've got temporary fencing. Then we look at soils, and the sort of within the soils layer, we're also broadening this a bit more recently into human health, because there's an enormous link between the microbiome of our gut and the soils. and the way that we manage those on our farms or anywhere. And then, but we're also looking from the soils perspective at how we actually manage the livestock and the cropping systems that we have. So this is soils is a real management layer. It's not a development layer.
Okay.
So that's all of Yeoman's layers with changes in emphasis. And then our extra layers that we've added on are economy, because obviously, you can't be green and in the red. And so that's a really important thing for us. And so all of the parameters around that, whether it's when we talk about economy, we're talking about how do you manage your social networks, how do you manage your narrative as business, what's involved with your financial planning and all of the more traditional economic analysis. So it's really about marketing as much as it is about financial management. And then lastly, we have the energy layer, and this is not necessarily about metaphysics, although that's up to you. But for most people, that's where we're looking at how do we extend photosynthesis for the longest period possible by our actions, particularly in our management of the soil layer. But then also, what are we doing about our energy future in terms of energy supplies and storage? Because we've been living in a fairly nice little period in the oil age where we haven't had to think too much about that in this fossil fuel age, and now that its end is upon us for a variety of reasons, not just from a supply perspective. So what are we doing about how we strategise to keep the lights going and keep our mobility and keep producing food and fibre products as we have in the past? So that's the layer. Now, they're the Regrarians platform layers. The REX program that we've developed is the Regrarians platform, and the REX is an acronym for Regrarians 10. So RE for Regrarians and X for 10. And what we looked at there is how can we develop a farm planning model that's both on-site and online, where farmers go through our complete program from start to finish. So they start with the climate and climate layer, and that determine their holistic context and do all of the self-determination stuff that I talked about before, as well as look at how hot, cold, wet, dry it is. And then look at all of the other layers. How do you build your map? How do you build your water, all of the development layers, water access, forestry, all of those. Mm-hmm. How do we manage our soils? Where are our soils at? And what do they need doing to them? Where are our livestock systems at? How do we have a plan for how they'll be best rotated through our landscape? And then what are we doing about our economy, our financial planning, and what's our broader energy strategy? So we put that into a 10-day program where people work on that in a
group setting,
a live format, and then we've also put that into a 13-week online format where people do each layer each week and then supply us with task work to show what they've done. And then we're about to launch this now. We're going on a world tour starting in April, where we're doing a 4-day version where people will bring their farm plans to a place and we'll help them online before that, and then they'll bring those farm plans and then we'll work with them over 4 days to have them develop a sort of a concept farm plan of what's going to happen, say, over the next 5 years. What are the real priorities for them right now? Again, using the platform, and we're doing that in about 10 different countries this year, so we're pretty excited about that, but it's sort of I'm almost tired thinking about it because I've done it before. We'll be going to some new places, which is always exciting. Haven't been to Uruguay or Brazil before, so I'm looking forward to going there.
I'm speaking with Darren Dougherty in Victoria, Australia, of Regrarians.org. Yes, because what happens is, from what I can gather, you can use satellite technology, or at least get a topographical map, so that people can look down on the whole map. And the technologies we can use today gives you a very good understanding of the lay of the land. And
when I started off, it took 2 weeks to get an aerial photo enlargement sent to me, whereas now everyone's got Google Earth. It's amazing. Topographical maps, which are really important to the control of water and to the design and proper planning of landscapes, are not as available. But even then, we can fly drones over landscapes now. When I did a drone map recently of a 500-acre property, 200-hectare property, it took 3 hours, and I was able to generate a half-metre contour map. It's amazing what you can do.
It certainly is. I've been fortunate to stay with Greg and Rachel Hart and Mangara down in Napier, and And you see, what he was doing for a while, when Air New Zealand became aware of their ecological footprint from aeroplanes,
yeah.
And he started a forestry there on his farm to sequester the CO2 back down into the ground. I think it's fantastic. And
it is, yeah. They've done an amazing job there, and we look forward to going there in September. They'll be the last stop on our next tour, so we're really looking forward to that. But, yeah, they're great people. And I've often talked about what Greg and Rachel were doing. And I just thought it was a really great effort, that he is the son of a farmer who's gone away, come back, and he's gone, okay, I think we need to do things a bit differently. How about I think outside of the box? And so he did, and he was brave. And I think Rachel and Greg are very brave, but they're sort of built that way. And I think New Zealand, and to an extent Australia, but particularly Kiwis, one thing I've observed about New Zealand agriculture is I think it's probably some of the most innovative in the world. And the reason for that, I did a study years ago where I went onto the CIA World Factbook, which is a really good online resource. Mm-hmm. It's got so much good data about different nations of the world. Anyway, I went on there because I had two questions. I was trying to work out the relationship between the average age of farmers, and the relationship between that and the GDP of the proportion of agriculture as the proportion of national GDP of individual countries. And I found that New Zealand has of all of the OECD and other countries, New Zealand has two leading figures. One is, which I think are very interesting and produce people like Greg and Rachel and many others. And that is that New Zealand has the highest, agriculture is the highest proportion of GDP of your country, of any country in the OECD. I think it's running at about 6%, which doesn't seem high, but it is actually very high compared to, I think Australia's about 3.8, and we're number 2 or 3 in that order. The UK, from memory, was about 0.8%. The great apparatus of British agriculture basically means nothing to their economy in real terms. And I looked at that, and then I looked at the average age of farmers, and it was actually New Zealand had the youngest average age of farmers in the world as well, in the OECD. And I thought, well, that's it. And then you just look at how many great innovations, how much on-farm forestry goes on, and, it's not an agricultural paradise by any stretch. And the other thing that's really interesting is, of all of the OECD, New Zealand receives the least subsidies.
Yes.
Australia's number 2. And so that really drives innovation as well. And so people come home and they go, all right, well, I'm not going to get 50% of my income, my farm income, come from the EU as what happens there. Mm-hmm. That's what does happen there. I'm going to have to be really innovative. And so, we've spoken to people around the world about what Greg and Rachel did and said, well, here's two people that got off their butt and they tried to work this out. And I think that that's incredibly inspirational, and people may not know that it has been very inspirational to a lot of other people around the world when we've talked about that story. And they've gone on and done similar things, whether it's very localised or otherwise, which is great.
Yes, no subsidisation in New Zealand, whereas, as you say, Europeans, huge amounts of subsidies.
Yes, most of our clients, it averages about 50% of their total income.
Yeah, astonishing. One of the interesting things I saw, or one of the lovely things I saw the other day, I was a little bit longer than the other day, Greg, a statement on his Facebook page, I love farming. And when you go there, you can tell by him and the land why he loves farming, and that's where the connection lies. This is where you put your life into it.
Yeah, well, you have to. I mean, it's been quite a while since I could put my farmer hat on, unfortunately, but my calling has been in other directions, and that's just the way it is. But I do certainly empathise with that statement. And look, I think that there's a lot of people, there's a whole new phase of rural resettlement going on, and that's happening all around the world. We've got, in the last few years, we've seen a reversal in the trends of people doing agricultural education from degrees downwards. So that's really encouraging. So there's a lot of people who are sort of going, okay, well, I think there is a future in this agriculture thing. So when you do the back of the envelope, it's bloody obvious why. You've got 7.5 billion people and you've got about 5 billion hectares of agricultural land. So that's only about 7,000 square metres each. And one figure's going up and one figure's going down. So definitely need to have more people involved in the production of food, fibre and energy crops, and that's just the way it's going to be. So I think a few people are sort of cottoning on to that. And hopefully the prices that producers receive will better than what they've been. The terms of trade in agriculture have been appalling. And so a lot of young people who've grown up on farms have listened to their parents' difficulties and sort of go, well, of course I'm not going to do this. But then there's a new generation of producers who are sort of taking the bull by the udder and saying, all right, well, I want to do this. We love our land. We love being farmers. How are we going to make it so that it works for us? And how are we going to make it so that our family can be on here? We're not going to talk it down like we have in the past, and we're going to try and self-determine. And again, when I look at the character of I'm a bit of an amateur anthropologist, and when I look at the character of different people, and I look at the Kiwi farmer is probably one of the most pragmatic group of people that I've met.
Yes,
but they're
definitely
also very, very passionate about their land. I mean, I met Harry Weir, and Harry's become a friend over the years of the Kiwi Tech International in Bulls.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a techno-grazing course there that I was a guest of, and it was a really great course. And Harry's a great fellow, and I mean, talk about a genius. He's an incredible genius. I don't know why he's Sir Harry. He probably wouldn't allow himself to be called Sir Harry, but he is an incredible person and incredible capability, has his family around him. Anyway, when we did the course at his place, the first thing he said is, I won't offend anyone here, but my God is productivity. And I thought that's such a statement that typifies the classic Kiwi producer. But I thought in breaking that down a bit, Harry's motivations are, yes, being able to produce as much as he can for himself and his family and his country, but also to make his land better, because you can't have one without the other. You can't have unending productivity without actually taking care of the base. And the base, from our perspective, is yourself, your land, your family and your society, and they all have to work together.
Very much so. It's all about connection. Now, can I mention nutrient dense? This is a real important one, because we know that in many ways the food that we've been getting, say, from the supermarket is not what you call fully mineralized. It's got the full spectrum of minerals. When you have a nutrient dense food and you know that you're taking into your body the best that the earth can provide.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, this one. We've got our own private forum called the Regrarians Workplace, and we've got thousands of producers from all over the world on it. We talk about this quite regularly because there's a perception that organic is, and there's certainly been some analyses to support this, but there's a perception that it's only organic or ecologically produced production that is so-called nutrient dense. And the evidence that we've seen from some producers who follow, there's a lot of conventional producers who go to the nth degree as far as supplying the mineral needs of their soils and then on with their plants. Yes, they do use some pesticide or herbicide, but when it comes to their soils, they take a lot of care to provide the mineral base so that the plants that they produce are, by default, quite nutrient dense. And then there's some organic farmers who practice practices which don't really support that. They don't do the mineral application and whatnot.
I see.
So it's not, the devil's in the detail here, and I'm always very cautious of making carte blanche statements about, you'll only get nutrient dense if you eat from this particular sector of agriculture. It's too complex to make that sort of statement, in my opinion. And when I've looked at the soil tests and the leaf tissue analyses from all forms of agriculture, they're incredibly diverse. One group that we've been working with, which is interesting, and I'll be fortunate enough to catch up with them again this year, is a group that's been led by a man called Jairo Restrepo. He's a Colombian agronomist who is a tour de force. He's a complete force of nature. And what he's done more recently, in, say, the last 10 years, is he's resurrected a methodology called chromatography. And chromatography is basically, it was developed by an esoteric scientist, but she was a scientist called Lily Kalisko, one of those Prussian geniuses who emigrated to Mexico in the 1900s. And it's a method of assaying the connection between the volume of mineral supply and the life that's actually available in your soil as well. And that's one of the things that a lot of people, both conventional and organic, are talking about. More and more conventional farmers are shifting onto using more and more biological methods. So what they're basically doing is they're being pragmatic. They're saying, all right, well, I need to have a bit of control over this nature, because nature can be a bit of a hound on my productive bottom line at times. So I'll use some of the tools that we can to drive her in my favour from time to time, right? But I'm still going to use some of the lessons that we've got from biological agriculture, which is where we're, doing novel seed coats, where we're adding mycorrhizal fungi and other mixtures to our soils. We're doing compost teas. There's all sorts of things that a lot of conventional farmers now are using, which used to only be in the domain of the biological farmer. And a lot of people, again, aren't aware that that's all going on, because they're not talking to both camps, or they're not paying attention. And we do. And so when you do the chromatography, is a really honest and very cheap, it costs about $1 a sample, assessment of the connection between the mineral and living worlds in your soil. And it in itself is a way of being able to assess the volume of mineral availability that comes from a food. And I don't know of any other methodology that allows you to do that, because otherwise it's straight chemistry or it's straight biology. And that's just not, from my perspective, good enough, because we're much more complex than that. And it's the complexity that's overlooked here, whether it's we're overlooking at it by saying, oh, well, conventional agriculture produces nutrient-loose food, but all organic agriculture gives you all the minerals that you need. I mean, that's just BS.
Yes.
It just doesn't work that. That's just a stupid thing to say. So, to be quite blunt. So we're really happy with working with people like Jairo, because he's providing that evidence, which is science-based and very, very clear, and is cheap. And it gives people that ability to be able to really clearly analyse what's going on. And then also look at Jairo and his colleagues throughout Latin America in particular, and now also in the UK, have developed a whole range of ways in which farmers can create their own fertilisers and all of the rest of it, so that they maintain their productivity and fertility. So it's a great question, and we're very curious about, because one thing that we talk about in terms of narratives with a lot of our clients is about honesty.
Yes.
And when you start to use the claims of others, which you yourself have not tested, then that puts you into some danger. And so we're very, so if you start to say, oh, you're nutrient dense, and you haven't proved that, well, someone's going to come knocking on your door potentially, and they're going to go, well, prove it. And you're going to go, oh, I haven't done any monitoring for the last 20 years, but I've been saying I'm nutrient dense.
This is very good. Excellent. Darren, and I'm wanting to cover, can you tell us, I've got two questions, but can you tell us very quickly for people, they'll say, what's keyline mean? I know about the ploughing, but can you express it clearly?
I can, and thanks for the question, because it's one that's often not asked. Keyline, I call it the Keyline Plan, because yeoman's always referred to it as that. So I'd like to pay homage to originators, just as a respect thing. I think it was how I was raised. Yeah, I call it the Keyline Plan. And the Keyline Plan, as yeoman's defined it often, was it's all about, it's a farm planning method to, as yeoman said, to control water. And I would add to that, because to control water is to be able to control a greater part of your agricultural destiny. So the Keyline Plan is, as I described before, it's based on the consideration of the Keyline scale of permanence, which is climate, land shape, water, farm roads, farm trees, farm buildings, subdivision fencing, and soils. So if you consider all of those in their order of influence, priority, and permanent in developing a farm plan that controls water, then you're well on your way to having, as Yeomans was a great patriot, and he was a farmer's patriot. I really point that out. He was on the farmer's side, and he really wanted farmers to be able to self-determine, and as opposed to be dependent on the government or dependent on a channel that supplied you with water coming by and all of that. He just understood the numbers as an engineer. He looked at a farm landscape and go, there's enough water in any farm. Even when you get 8 inches of rain on an average farming acreage, that's a lot of water. What are you doing with it? What's happening when it impacts your landscape?
Yes.
And all of those things. So he looked at all of that through that lens and said, all right, well, how can we plan a property so that it can accept and control water as well as it can, And when you do that, then you're going to be much more in control of your destiny. And that was what he was all about. The rest is up to you, how good a manager you are and all of the rest of it. You know, you can have the best farm plan in the world, but you've still got to manage it.
Very good. Yes, well, with regenerative agriculture at the moment, I mean, there's a real upswell. I'm very, very confident that in the next 5 or 7 years, there will be a huge swing globally as people realise the seriousness of what's happening in the global climate, that the biosphere is under so much pressure. And I feel that we're going to make a big breakthrough because we can sequester so much CO2 out of the atmosphere. And as you have stated in your Regrarians.org, you say that we can basically take all the CO2 out within 10 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's all. Things are possible, but whether they're doable, that's another matter. Yeah, it's quite clear that, and this is, you know, Dr. Ratan Lal, who's the soil carbon god or Professor Lal from the University of Ohio, he and many others have made it very clear that if we increase the soil carbon content by about 1.5% in all of the world's arable soils, where we sort of have the greatest influence, then that would sequester, well, that would draw down about 100 parts per million of CO2, which would bring us back to pre-industrial levels. So there it is. Can we do it? Well, that's another matter. That's a climate between the minds sort of thing. That's a political climate as much as anything else. And good luck with that, because there's a huge, as any casual observer would have right now, I mean, there's a huge chasm in even the belief in climate change. And whilst there might only be a small proportion of people in the world who don't believe in climate change, they just happen to have their fingers on the buttons. And so that means that we have less and less support. It's harder to actually get to stop having political inertia on the topic. But there's also the private sphere, and we're very encouraged by what we're seeing, and we'll continue to see. I think if you look at all of the development that have occurred, you know, whether you go back to the all original organic stuff that happened in the 1950s, and biodynamics and whatnot, and then the permaculture movement and Keyline to an extent before that, they all met up with various levels of pretty heavy resistance from conventional. Regenerative agriculture is quite different, and I think, you know, like I cited before, there's not a lot of resistance in the grazing field to doing better grazing management. That's pretty well established. So I think in the grazing landscapes of the world, they will shift quite well. In the cropping world, in the production of annual crops world, we're starting to see a pretty big shift there because of the advent and understanding of the productive value of cover crops and mixed species cover crops, and the reintegration into those landscapes of livestock, which is something that we've really simplified and changed over the last 20 years in particular. So yeah, we're positive, and we continue to be, and we hang out with more positive people than negative. So I don't know, maybe I'm badly influenced there too.
You're on the right.
I've been seeing all the signs. It looks pretty good.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I know that.
And the world's robust. That's the other thing. People talk about things are going to collapse all the time, and I get really tired of that kind of talk. They just don't realise how robust planetary systems are. But that said, there's limits to everything. Yeah, this world wants to live.
You bet.
So we just need to realise that and start behaving like we're perennial species as opposed to annuals, because if we keep behaving like annuals, well, then we'll get chewed up and spat out before you know it. That's just a simple rule of ecology that my grandfather gave me when I was about 8, and that is, you know, Dazza, humans are just like yeast. They eat all of the sugar and then they'll die in their own shit. And so there you go.
Yeah. One last thing I was going to talk about is pastoral intelligence. How do you see the sacredness of the land? Because Maori here, they see Mother Earth as Papatūānuku as something that's very present. I mean, you have something in your bones?
Oh, definitely. So that said, it's really interesting. I think about this quite a lot. I've got a lot of Indigenous friends, and I've worked enough with Indigenous peoples around the world to understand the difference between those and those of the West, who are largely Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic in their belief.
Yes.
And all of the Abrahamic religions have a belief in domain, which is quite different to the belief of most Indigenous people, where they are a part of. as opposed to they are the dominant partner.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of Westerners, you sort of have to border into the sort of hippie stuff almost to be able, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, true.
It's quite a shift in our culture to actually start to believe in the earth as a mother.
Yes.
And as a provider. Like if I said that to a lot of people, they go, what are you smoking, you know? Whereas if I said that in Indigenous people, or if I said to people, and I was working in Indigenous areas and I said I want to dominate all of this, and I'm the key person, they go, who are you? What are you smoking? So I think that my personal belief is, absolutely, I'm a confused Westerner in a lot of ways, like so many people are, because of our cultural underpinnings that have brought us to whatever point, and that I live between these two worlds where I see and I love how well-connected people are who might be called classically pagan. Then I look at my own Irish history and I look at, well, gee, there's plenty in that as well.
Yes,
and then I look
Celts.
at this sort of Abrahamic pathway over the last 6,000 years and look at how that was a bit of a disruptor in all of this. So, and how human domain has been given and how that's influenced the psychology and also the approach that people have to that. But I still reckon that people have got that in their bones. If you're a farmer,
You're right.
if you're a person of the land, or if you're, I should say, if you're a land manager, because lots of other people out there who are doing like restoration work and all of that, you know, they may not own a block of land, but they're out there making habitat for other organisms and all of that. I mean, what's driving them?
Yeah, it's very much so. It's a love. I've simplified it as far as I'm concerned. And Darren, it's Mother Earth, or our planet, lends us a body, lends us free air, free rainwater, and until recently, a free food chain. What do we do in reciprocity?
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, have fun.
Darren, thank you. Thank you, brother. This has been excellent. I really appreciate your time, and I want to say thank you for giving me of your precious time. I recognise the fact that you've given Kiwis this opportunity.
No worries. Well, always appreciate the opportunity. That's what we give time to. Great opportunities. All right. Thanks, mate. All the best with it.
Cheers, brother.
Hopefully we'll get to catch you when we're next over there.
We will. I'll make the effort.
Right. Take care, mate.
Thank you, brother.
All right. Hooray.
Bye-bye. That was Darren Dougherty of Regrarians.org. Regrarians.org. And the word Regrarian is a neologism of regenerative agrarian, and it's a term first coined by Darren Dougherty in 2013 to describe those who are actively undertaking the serious and timely process of regenerating, restoring, rehabilitating, rekindling, and rebooting production landscapes, be they urban or rural, around our planet. So I invite you to have a look at regrarians.org and particularly go through and look at the short videos. You can get them also on YouTube, and they are very, very, very powerful and will inspire you and inspire us. This is a heads up for Phil Gregory. Phil Gregory on greenplanetfm.com. This was a very unique interview. And this is what we need at this moment. Decide to network. Use every letter you write, every conversation you have, every meeting you attend, every email you send. And remember, even Facebook. To tweet and to express your fundamental beliefs and dreams. Affirm to others the vision of the world you want. Network through thought. Network through action. Network through love. Network through the spirit. You are the center of a network. You are the center of the world. You are a free, immensely powerful source of life and goodness. Affirm it. Spread it. Radiate it. Think day and night about it, and you will see a miracle happen. The greatness of your own life in a world of big powers, media and monopolies, but of 7.7 billion individual souls, networking is the new freedom, the new democracy, a new transparency. and a new form of wholeness and happiness. This originated by Dr. Robert Muller, Chancellor of the World Peace University in Costa Rica, Central America. I invite you to be able to come to greenplanetfm.com, where we have over 400 interviews in our database, which you can readily download and listen to be able to inspire yourself to become the change you want to see in the world and become involved in caring for your children and grandchildren's future. We are also on Facebook, on Green Planet FM and ourplanet.org. Please come and love us.